I'm David Lombardino, Editor-in-Chief of DLA Editors and Proofers, here to talk to you about writing an outstanding personal statement. Today I want to talk specifically about using quotes in a personal statement. There are 4 types of quotes that we see used in a personal statement. First type is going to be from somebody world famous, like George Washington or Nelson Mandela. Second type is going to be from somebody maybe not so famous, but still known by a lot of people, like for example, a professor or an attending physician. Third type of quote is going to be somebody more personal to you, like a close friend or a close family member. And finally, the 4th type of quote is going to be one like in dialogue in the context of telling a story in your personal statement. And I want to go down each of those 4 types and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each one and when it might be appropriate to use each one in a personal statement. So, the first one, somebody world famous. These people are usually dead. I mentioned the examples of George Washington or Nelson Mandela. Now, the way we see these used in a personal statement is at the beginning of the personal statement, and it can come in one of 2 ways. One way would be as like a caption or subheading before the actual start of the personal statement. Another way would be in the introduction itself of the personal statement. And what we see time and time again is when these quotes are used at the beginning of a personal statement is that they serve only to delay the beginning of a personal statement. Now, what I mean by that is that I understand that as the candidate, you want to write a personal statement that's engaging, that's going to get the reader's attention, going to make the program director want to read from beginning to end. And so you want to hook the reader. Now, the mistake that a lot of people make is to think that finding some sort of famous quote is going to be something that hooks the reader. And there's a few problems with this. First of all, you're not being judged as a candidate based on your ability to use Google to find a quote to use in a personal statement, nor are you being judged on your ability to know what famous people have said. You're being judged on your personal characteristics. And generally speaking, when you go to refer to somebody else, you bring in a quote of something that somebody else said or wrote, what you're doing is you're taking the focus off of you and you're putting it on them. Now, I understand that it can be difficult to know how to start writing your personal statement, where to begin. And then it may be helpful to find a quote or to think of a quote from a famous person. And I'm not entirely against that. I've seen cases where a candidate finds a quote that's interesting just to get the thought process going, and then an initial draft has that quote up there at the beginning. Then writes a personal statement. Now, that's perfectly fine for an initial draft, but what you're going to want to do as you move forward in developing that personal statement, taking it to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 10th, maybe even 15th draft, you're going to want to take that quote out. And that's one of the first things that we do when we receive a personal statement to work on, is that we identify that the personal statement, in other words, your personal narrative, starts actually after the quote. And the problem with using a quote like this, beyond simply getting your ideas going and trying to leave it in the final version, is that it's impossible for the narrative that you describe in your personal statement to actually match the quote. Now, you're going to have certain themes in your personal statement. You're going to have a certain tone and style and voice in the personal statement and the body of it. And it's going to come across, it's going to be very difficult to write that successfully if you're trying to fit it to that quote. And so then that quote is going to come across as it doesn't fit. And that's the one thing that you want to think about in terms of your personal statement. And thinking about that type of quote, and then as we go into the other 3 categories of quotes that I mentioned, we want to think about what is the purpose of a personal statement. And that purpose is to tell your personal narrative, your unique story of how you came to apply for the program you're applying for today, why this program, and where it's taking you. And when you think about that, you're going to realize that starting with a quote from somebody who has really nothing to do with you is not going to work. It doesn't fit. And so what ends up happening is not only does it come across as not fitting, but it comes across as somebody's using a quote, it comes across as a crutch. In other words, somebody who doesn't have confidence in his or her own story and so is relying on the words of other people to do that. And that's automatically going to be a red flag for the personal statement. It's automatically going to cause the program director or admissions committee member to lose interest in you as a candidate, lose interest in reading your personal statement. And in fact, that person may stop right there with reading your personal statement and considering your application. Because what the program director and the admissions committee member wants to hear is your personal story. And so that gets us to the second type of quote, which has a lot of the same type of problems as that first type. The second type is when you are quoting somebody who is known by a lot of people. That could be, I mentioned, a professor or an attending physician. In other words, you may have met that person personally, you may personally know that individual, and you may have heard that person say whatever it is you're quoting, but it's not that statement that was made by that person is not intended for you personally. It's intended for a large audience. And whenever something is intended for a large audience, it's generally not going to be successful in a personal statement. Remember, the personal statement is your personal narrative. It's your specific story. And so when you're talking about something that happens to a general population, it's generally going to be difficult for it to work well in your personal statement. That's not to say that it can't happen, but if it's going to work well in your personal statement, this second category, it can't be as a caption or subheading or something like that before the start of your personal statement. It needs to be something that fits specifically and fits necessarily into the flow of your narrative. In other words, you have your narrative, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, etc., from beginning to end, and that quote slots in perfectly and necessarily into that sequence. And I'm going to talk about the necessity, when it's necessary to use quotes and when it's not necessary to use quotes as I move into the remaining two categories. So just hold on to that idea. Now, the third type of quote that I mentioned is going to be from somebody who is close to you. So a close friend or a close family member. Now, when we're talking about close friends or close family members, I want to include in this also somebody who maybe you don't know over a long period of time, but maybe has an impact in your story. And so that could be, for example, you go to your professor's office after hours to discuss some issues you're having with your class, and that professor in a one-on-one meeting says something to you that profoundly shakes you up, profoundly shifts your worldview or the path that you're on. Or you go to a doctor's visit, for example, or to the hospital with, say, appendicitis. And you see how that physician or that nurse handles your questions or treats you, or there's something in that interaction that shifts your focus or shifts your career path, then that's something that can fit into your personal story. You don't want to just go off and say, well, you know, my neighbor always says this, or my father always said this, if it does not fit necessarily into the sequence of your narrative. And so that's really what I want you to consider, is when you're building your narrative, building your personal statement from beginning to end, how is it that quote fits in? Now, a lot of times, parents or close family members do have a strong influence on a person or a child or a candidate. And so when you're talking about how your path developed, it's going to be something that you will want to include. I mean, that's definitely something that could fit into that narrative and can be a really compelling point in the story that you're presenting to the program director or admissions committee member. And as I move into the fourth type, I want you to think about this and whether it's actually a good idea for your personal statement to quote that person as opposed to paraphrasing that person. And so to give you a quick definition of paraphrasing, paraphrasing is when you take somebody else's words and you put them into your own. A quote would be, my mom said, David, go to the store. Or my mom told me to go to the store. So the first one is a quote and the second one is paraphrasing. Now, remember that idea for this third category about a close family member, a close friend, or a unique encounter with somebody as I move into the fourth category. And the fourth category is when you're wanting to quote somebody in the form of dialogue or what somebody said in the context of telling a story for your personal statement. And I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about going into your professor's office to discuss a particular issue or going into a doctor's visit or a hospital and you have a unique encounter. Now, that encounter could fit into this fourth category of telling a story for the personal statement. And here it is really where, of the four categories, you're most likely going to find it appropriate to quote somebody, but not necessarily. There's two problems with quoting somebody in terms of telling a story in your personal statement. And one is going to be that, generally speaking, when we see candidates wanting to include stories in a personal statement, it's very easy for it to go off base, in the sense that they get more focused on the telling of the story using kind of flowery language, a lot of adjectives, a lot of adverbs, and they lose sight of the content of the story and the actual purpose that story is to tell or is to have in the personal statement, in that narrative. And that's something that I want you to think about. Think about, how does that story fit into the narrative, okay? Because you may not need to quote what everybody said in terms of telling that story. There may be some parts of it that you leave out, or you may find it more efficient or simply more effective to paraphrase what a person said rather than providing a direct quote. One of the issues that you may run into when telling a story in a personal statement, even if it fits the narrative and even if it fits in that particular spot in the narrative, is that by quoting somebody, you end up using a lot more words than if you were to paraphrase that person. And so when you think about whether to quote somebody or paraphrase somebody, think about the overall length and word count of your personal statement. Now, I get into word count and the length of a personal statement in another video, but I want you to just hold on to that in terms of how quotes can work in your personal statement for the scope of this video. Now, I hope that I've covered all of your questions or concerns about quotes. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any more questions about how a quote might work in your personal statement. We offer a full range of personal statement services, from proofreading to revision and critique to consultation. Come check us out at www.dlaeditors.com.